Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom.
I think we all know how David Bowie felt.
Yeah, we do.
Writing that song. It's been like
Mike Barnacle.
trying to get Barnacle in Boston all morning.
It just doesn't work.
It's not working.
All right, in his latest op-ed for the Wall Street Journal entitled, Portland's Half-Century of Ruinous Leadership, Mark Hemingway writes in part this: as a third-generation Oregonian and former Portland resident, I've been bombarded with questions over the past few months about why one of America's whitest cities has descended into civic madness following the police killing of George Floyd. Violent radicalism had been flourishing in the city for years before the rest of the country paid attention, and Mayor Ted Wheeler's feckless leadership is no anomaly. The situation in Portland has been enabled by 50 years of political leadership that has been as corrupt and depraved as it has been progressive. I love Portland like no other city, and it is hard to square what's happening with residents of the city I am blessed to know. Their commitment to rectifying injustice is sincere. They abhor violence, and they are patriotic Americans. But if Portlanders believe progressive governance requires rejecting basic notions of law and order, they are, to paraphrase H.L. Mencken, getting what they vote for good and hard.
So, Mike, it's interesting. I've been critical of the ongoing problems in Portland. And, of course, people on the left, far left, have attacked me. How dare you side with Donald Trump? Well, Portland's been this way for years. I remember seeing violence in Seattle and Portland during past environmental marches, World Trade Organization marches, like 20 years ago. This is nothing new for Portland. Even in 2017, as Mark points out, Republicans just wanted to have an event downtown, and the city was threatened with violence there. So this Portland problem is an ongoing problem, and we do see it in other cities. But that Donald Trump is trying to make this an election based on Portland's problems or Seattle's problems seem just disingenuous, because the problems, as Hemingway points out here, long predated the Black Lives Matter marches and Donald Trump.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Joe, there's no doubt about that. Portland, Seattle, Kenosha, Minneapolis, you can name the city. We can watch the scenes on TV. All of this is taking place at a time, for the first time in our history, when the president of the United States intentionally provokes and promotes such violence. That's the difference. I mean, Mark Hemingway, a respected guy, he's, not all wrong in his description about what the far left sometimes seeks. Sometimes it's a little too far left for a lot of people to understand. But in this case, it's the President of the United States. And you can feel out there, Joe, I bet not just in Portland, but throughout the country, the principal need that a lot of people feel now is we have to calm this country down. And unfortunately, one of the two candidates for president is intent on not calming the country down. And one of the things the Biden campaign, I think, will probably engage itself in is pointing out to the American public that Donald Trump has been president for 1,321 days. When he was sworn in on January 20th, 2017, there was no virus. The unemployment rate was 4.1%. Your children were going to school. Cities were not embroiled in racial tension as they are now. But here we are. 30 million people are unemployed. People live in anxiety and sometimes fear of contracting the virus because the government, the federal government, led by Donald J. Trump, has done very little to address it nationally and come up with solutions nationally at a point in time when it could have made a difference. And the big thing right now, at this moment, on the 2nd of September is, can you put your children in school? Well, you can't. All of that is on Donald J. Trump.
Well, and Jason,
his watch.
And Jason Johnson, also Donald Trump points to Portland as a way to undermine and discredit the 25 million Americans, black, white, Hispanic, Asian Americans, the 25 million Americans that went out and marched peacefully. And that's, again, two things can be true at once. You can have 25 million people marching in the tradition of John Lewis, and at the same time, you can have idiots on all sides. Proud Boys we saw yesterday showing up in Kenosha. The 17-year-old kid, anarchists, Marxists, whatever. You can have people on all sides using any march. And I talked about environmental marches, WTO marches 20 years ago, to try to stoke violence just as an excuse. And Donald Trump can't even say yesterday that there's systemic racism, can't even credit the 25 million people who marched peacefully over the past summer.
Yeah, Joe, this is the reality, and this is, again, why we have to make sure that we don't allow the president to change the frame. For the vast majority of Americans, if you're in Lorain, Ohio, if you're in suburban Charlotte, if you're living outside of Austin, you know the Black Lives Matter protests you've seen? They're next to Target. It's 25 kids, and some parents saying Black Lives Matter. You wave to them as you drive to work. That's what it looks like for most people. It's not Kenosha. It's not Portland. So we can't let the president pretend that particular hotspots are indicative of how most people are experiencing human rights marches. Here's the other thing. He is encouraging terrorism. Let's be clear, the Proud Boys are terrorists. If you look at video from Portland, you don't see Black Lives Matter protesters walking around with guns, walking around with paintballs, walking around with military equipment. That is what is happening with the fascists who are there, with the Proud Boys who are there, and way too many police officers are working with them. So that's what we have to point out, that the president is a terrorist sympathizer at this particular point, while regular people are doing human rights marches and then trying to go back home and teaching their kids math because the Wi-Fi is bad in the house.
Yeah, and Miki, one of the most offensive things from the RNC for me was when Mike Pence talked about the marches and the violence that spilled out of the marches, and actually used a DHS officer in Oakland who was shot dead, suggesting that the Black Lives Matter protesters were responsible for his death, when in fact it was a member of a right-wing, alt-right group, of course, organized on Facebook, that actually drove there specifically to gun down an officer using the peaceful marches that at least 25 million people, 25 million people, using those marches as an excuse to kill somebody.
And we need to talk about Facebook at a separate time. But sticking with the Wall Street Journal, the paper's editorial board has a piece entitled Benjamin Franklin, Person of Concern, in which it writes, in part, "A republic if you can keep it." Benjamin Franklin's 1787 quip about the government Americans would have is probably the most popular founding-era wisdom still with us. Maybe not for long. As if to prove Franklin's insight about the tendency of republics to self-destruct, a District of Columbia panel has identified Franklin, among other founders, as a person of concern and recommended his name to be removed from D.C. property. Many backers of the summer's protest movement say they want to perfect the founding principles, not demolish them, and that they support the removal of Confederate statues for that reason. That's the image Democrats presented at their national convention. If it's true, then Biden Democrats should be the first to blast the district's efforts to dishonor the people who created the Constitution they are sworn to protect.
And Bob Costa, this recommendation obviously won't be followed through on, but this is the sort of thing that Donald Trump will obviously cling to. It's also the sort of thing that a lot of Americans, I would be shocked if a single Democratic leader, if a civil rights leader said, no, we need to relocate the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. But it's out there and obviously will be used by Donald Trump But Democrats have said, have they not, let's focus on the Confederate statues and not those of Washington or Jefferson?
I spoke to Speaker Pelosi about this the other day, and she dismissed the idea of getting rid of all these founding fathers at this time. She said she's focused on the Confederacy. But these kind of issues, Joe, reflect the intense pressure on the Biden campaign as the president and his allies stoke these culture wars and try to draw Vice President Biden into these debates, which the Trump campaign privately tells me sees as losing ground and bad turf for VP Biden. But what's notable this week is not just what the Biden campaign is saying in its ads, it's what it's not saying in its ads. And you look at that new ad that takes a snippet from his recent speech in Pittsburgh. He's not having a so-called Sister Soldier moment like Bill Clinton had in 1992, where Bill Clinton took on this minor figure, a black woman from the music community, a rap artist, and used her as a foil. Instead, Biden's using President Trump as a foil. He's not trying to have a direct, explicit Sister Soldier moment. And that tells you a lot about the Biden campaign. It tells you a lot about this crossroads in 2020.
Yeah, and Elise, we've seen some extreme moments this past summer that some have jumped on. You know, like, for instance, Frederick Douglass's statue being torn down. Isn't it safe to say that whether it's Speaker Pelosi or Joe Biden or other Democratic leaders, they're not going to be coming out suggesting that these statues of George Washington or monuments of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson be torn down?
No, the Trump campaign wants to pick this battle. It wants to bait Democratic leaders into engaging in statue wars and talking about inanimate objects instead of talking about the real crisis that's plaguing the country, the coronavirus pandemic that's affecting so many African American and minorities disproportionately. They'd rather talk about symbols and not the substance of what's going on. And I do think that also this is, you know, looking at those images that are on the screen right now of destruction in Kenosha, I think it's naive to think that those images do not have electoral meaning with some voters who might be leaning towards voting for Biden, but they're a little scared. So Democrats need to continue reiterating the message that they aren't for lawlessness, that they're for order, and that the rioting is completely unacceptable.
Well, and that's, again, that's why, Mika, I think Joe Biden's ad is so impactful and so powerful, because Joe Biden is condemning the violence. He's condemning the looting. He's condemning the criminality that's been going on at the fringes of a lot of these protests and a lot of these marches. And he's condemning violence on both sides.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is not.
Yeah.
Donald Trump will not condemn violence on his side. In fact, he's encouraging violence on his side. Just look at his Twitter feed.
And what Biden is talking about is absolutely restoring order and then doing better within that. Now to this, speaking at the RNC, President Trump wildly mischaracterized Joe Biden's position on abortion.
Joe Biden claims he has empathy for the vulnerable, yet the party he leads supports the extreme late-term abortion of defenseless babies right up until the moment of birth. Democrat leaders talk about moral decency, but they have no problem with stopping a baby's beating heart in the 9th month of pregnancy.
Joining us now, senior editor at The Dispatch and a columnist for Time, David French. He's out with a new piece entitled, "Do Pro-Lifers Who Reject Trump Have Blood on Their Hands?"
David, thanks so much for being with us. I suspect that this column came straight from your heart, because obviously you have serious concerns about Donald Trump. I just want to say off the top, I'm so sick and tired of people justifying everything under the sun based on the single issue of abortion, and they do. Whether it's the caging of children, whether it's just the violence done to Madisonian democracy, you name it, they all just go back and justify it based on a single issue. Most of them doing it cynically.
Yeah, a lot of them are doing it cynically. And, you know, as you said, we've got a cultural pyromaniac as president of the United States. We have a horribly mishandled coronavirus pandemic with almost 200,000 Americans dead. And people are saying, well, you have blood on your hands if you don't support Donald Trump. So what I wanted to do was take a step back and let's just take a serious look at what we have learned in almost 50 years of pro-life activism. And what we've learned is pretty remarkable. Since the peak of the abortion rate in the U.S. in around 1980-81, it has declined through every single presidency. And that was something that I think is surprising for an awful lot of pro-lifers, that it declined during the pro-choice Clinton presidency. It declined during the pro-choice Obama presidency. There's been a big cultural change. And that's not just the rate, it's the ratio. It's the number of abortions per 100 pregnancies. That's all declined. And so what I wanted to show was, look, the way you think about pro-life activism is often upside down. You have the most influence on the people around you and your community and your state. You have the least influence on national politics. And this whole emphasis on judges, while judges are important, and judges decided Roe v. Wade, out of the 9 justices on the current Supreme Court right now, exactly one of the 9, and George H.W. Bush appointee Clarence Thomas has indicated that he's ready to overturn Roe and Casey. One of the 9 has said that. The 2 most recent Trump appointees applied the Casey standard recently in a case. Now, they weren't asked to overturn Roe, but they applied the Casey standard. They could have joined with Thomas. They chose not to. And so I wanted people to realize their pro-life activism is often upside down, overemphasizing the national, underemphasizing the personal and local.
When I left Congress, I had people ask me in interviews, well, what were some of your biggest takeaways? And I had big takeaways. They said, what about on legislation? What about on issues of the day? And I said, abortion was without a doubt the most twisted, exaggerated issue. It barely touched us. You would cast thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of votes. You would work around the clock on constituent services. You would do so many things. And then it would all be boiled down to a single issue that Washington really doesn't have a huge impact on. It just, I say that as somebody who was there, who was pro-life, who saw it day in and day out. It was a sideshow more than anything else. The issue as far as how Washington can change that, and you're right, that includes the courts.
Yeah, if you look at it like this, in the last 20 years, there have been basically 2 pieces of pro-life legislation that have gotten through Congress. Early 2000s, the Born Alive Infant Protection Act and the partial birth abortion ban, both of which impact a very, 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 very small percentage of abortions. The rest has been an awful lot of status quo, and that's because of polarization in this country. There's just been status quo. Where there's been real action has been at the state level. And that's one of the reasons why I just got so frustrated with conservatives, or I shouldn't say conservatives, let's say right-wingers in 2016, who were saying, Trumpists, who were saying that the conservative movement had done nothing. It was just losing before Donald Trump. It had huge gains in the states during the Obama era. And when it had gains in the states, it passed hundreds of pro-life laws at the state level. But at the federal level, you're then told that abortion will stand or fall based on Donald Trump, and it won't. Planned Parenthood had the most taxpayer funding of its history in 2019 under Donald Trump. That is not saying that abortion stands or falls under Trump.
Shauna, Thomas is with us and has a question. Shauna.
Hey, I'm just curious, though. It still has power as a general election or a federal election issue, doesn't it? I mean, this is part of why, Vice President Pence, then Governor Pence, was put on the ticket in the first place. This is part of why he's probably still on the ticket, to be honest. So how do we sort of square that? I understand what you're saying and that this is really a state's issue and that kind of thing, but the power it has politically, can that really be denied?
Oh, it can't be denied that it has huge political power. There are going to be millions of people who will go to the polls and hold their nose to vote for Donald Trump for one reason and one reason only, and that is abortion. And what I am saying is they have a misperception of the power of the president of the United States over this issue. Not that there isn't a perception, and not even that the federal election doesn't have importance. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying people completely misperceive the importance, that it is more important empirically what you do to combat, if you're pro-life, what you do to combat abortion at the state and local level than at the national level. But there will be millions of people, and I know people as an evangelical conservative, I know people who the one reason why they are voting for Donald Trump is they believe they'll have blood on their hands of unborn children if they don't. And what I'm saying and what I did in this piece is I tried to take a 40-plus year look at where has progress been made, what is most effective, where can you actually make an impact. And time again, it comes up that you don't make that much of an impact at all at the federal level, and you make a big impact at the state and local level.
Elise Jordan is with us, David, and has a question for you. Elise.
Sure.
David, I'm so glad that you tackled this topic thoughtfully, because this is the number one issue that I hear from so many conservative voters in the South. And as you have written and researched and talking to people in your evangelical community about this idea, what kind of reception has it gotten?
Very mixed. And I would say it's mixed by generation. I think there's an older generation who's been sort of raised from the beginning of their political advocacy to believe that the holy grail of all of conservative activism is the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And one of the things I pointed out in my piece is, yes, I am for the reversal of Roe v. Wade. We're very far from that. As I said, 1 out of 9 justices is on the record clearly saying they want to do that. But even if you did it, the way that abortion is practiced in the United States of America, it would still keep almost 90% of abortions would still continue. That's why state activism and local activism is so important. But the older generation looks at that one single court decision and says that is the be all and end all, and they get very angry. A lot of the younger generation that has been growing up in an area where abortion is less prevalent in their communities, they have seen the abortion rate falling. They sometimes wonder, they look at sort of this older paradigm and say, is this still right? This doesn't feel right. And they looked at my piece and they said, oh, yeah, this matches what I have seen and experienced. So I would say there was a pretty stark generational divide in the response to this. And just anecdotally, and I know that's not data, anecdata isn't data, but anecdotally, the response to this I saw was really separated out by generation, which also happens to be true about Trump in general. And a lot of older voters, I think, are looking for, they want to find that reason to support the guy that has contradicted every value in his personal life and his political values that they've held for much of their lives. And this is the one issue. This is the one. And what I'm saying to them is that, look, it's not accomplishing what you think it's accomplishing. And at the same time, he's hurting this country in ways that are so profound. It's almost an act of cruelty to inflict another 4 years of this on the American people.
Well, and David, something that pastors, evangelical pastors, are concerned about as well, they'll say it quietly behind the scenes, but they won't say it publicly, is that evangelicals being so closely associated to Donald Trump is damaging the church now and will cause profound damage to the church as we move forward. Because, again, while older evangelical singular focus may be on abortion, younger evangelicals, and I mean, I saw this even my last years of Congress, are concerned about feeding the poor, are concerned about what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, are concerned about having a leader that follows the tenets of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and they see their church supporting a guy who they believe, his very life is the antithesis of what Jesus preached about in the Beatitudes.
Yeah, you know, what's happening is you have a lot of younger evangelicals who are pro-life, but they're not locked into that one issue as the be-all and end-all. And they look at things like, what are these right-wingers doing, devaluing older Americans' lives in response to the coronavirus? How is that pro-life? They look at things like a cultural pyromaniac as president, somebody who is engaged in racially inflammatory rhetoric, and that's being generous to Trump, and rather than calling it outright racist, but somebody who's engaged in racially inflammatory rhetoric in this country. And they look at that and they say, I don't want my witness to America to be defined by inflicting a cruel and malicious person on the United States of America. And they're deeply troubled by it. And I think they're right to be troubled by the message the church is sending America when it's saying, we're going to support somebody who lies. We're going to support somebody who is unfit. We're going to support somebody who's malicious in the name of our specific set of issues. And I think that sends a message that the church doesn't want to send. And you're right. A lot of agreement to me is whispered. A lot of people are reluctant to say it. And a lot of disagreement with that perspective is shouted.
Yeah, and cages, of course, children as a matter of policy, and actually has a vote in the White House on making it the policy to cage children when their parents come to the border.
It's crazy. David French, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
For being on this morning.
Great having you, even though you have that horrid picture with an orange, just grotesque orange and white in the background.
All right now.
Well, that's my life. My alternate life is a wannabe sports podcaster. And just for you, Joe, I have Auburn's Jordan-Hare Stadium up over on that side. And Auburn's Jordan-Hare Stadium, just for you, just for you.
Uh-huh. I see that.
But, you know, you're one of the few people that I know, and Alex is screaming at me, both of my parents went to the University of Kentucky. And so, yes, my dad would drag us around and watch University of Kentucky basketball games our entire childhood. But you're one of the few people that remember that in like 1977, the Wildcats went like 10-1 in football. That was huge news in our household for George F. Scarborough. He was thrilled.
And a 10-win season 2 seasons ago. So it's Wildcat football on a renaissance.
Okay. Up next, thank you. We're going to circle back to the president's visit.